Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Recovery Talk. Sorry, I feel like I'm still chewing a bit. I just finished my breakfast. I've gotten a new favorite breakfast lately, and it is cereal and then adding tons of, is it called trail mix? The one with like raisins and nuts and all of those things. And then honey and then milk. Oh, it's so good. And just a reminder, if you are a fellow cereal enthusiast like me, serving sizes for cereal are complete scams. Nobody eats it's like 30 grams of cereal, whatever bullshit is on the package. Nobody. Maybe except some people with eating disorders who actually look at the serving size. But the serving size is a complete myth. I definitely eat way, way, way more than a serving size. And so does any non-disordered person I know about. So just a little reminder this morning or day or night or whatever time it is, wherever you are in the world. Another recovery reminder, you are allowed to go back for second or third or fourth, etc. sets of portions. I just finished a generous bowl of my cereal, but I definitely know that I want another bowl as soon as I'm done finishing the recording of this podcast. And that is completely okay. I don't necessarily talk much about what I eat, when I eat, etc., because I know people can compare themselves a lot, but I also know for some people, just getting these affirmations sometimes can be helpful. So yeah, I just thought I'd share. Also, apologies for the slight delay in this episode. I usually release the episodes on Tuesday mornings, but essentially a medical emergency came up. You may know if you follow me on Instagram. So usually I try to consistently just release episodes on Tuesday mornings, British time. But sometimes things happen, right? So there is a delay. As some of you may be aware, I have a few connected chronic illnesses. And as of now, the most annoying one is my dysautonomia, which is essentially dysfunction of my autonomous nervous system. The type of dysautonomia I have is something called postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. So it affects my heart, and the heart affects a lot of other things. So long story short, on bad days, I will collapse and wake up on the floor because my brain don't get blood. So basically I'll be unconscious, but I will wake up again. The problem, of course, is that I can't believe I haven't gotten a bad concussion yet, but that could happen. So it's always that risk of like when I fall, concussion risk, being monitored for concussion, etc., etc. So yeah, that was my very, very shitty illness. I do really wonder if I have any listeners who also have dysautonomia or dysfunction in the autonomous nervous system. It's apparently quite rare. The ambulance people who were there, they had never had a patient with that illness before. And I was very surprised. I was also thinking, you must have had patients with this illness. It's just that you haven't been aware because it is not that well known. Although it is quite rare, thankfully, because I don't want anyone else to suffer with this very, very, very disturbing illness. It is quite scary, not gonna lie. Anyways, from one illness to another, let's talk eating disorders, which this podcast is obviously about. A thing that I wanted to talk about today is what I call the eating disorder glasses. I may have mentioned this before, but I wanted to go a bit more in detail about how an eating disorder shape your worldview and how your eating disorder creates a form of confirmation bias that shapes how you view the world. So, you've often probably heard, or maybe if you've been pregnant or are pregnant yourself, that when someone is pregnant, they will see pregnant people everywhere. And the reason for this is obviously not that all of a sudden the pregnant population in their local area went up. Instead, the reason is just that, this person's focus now shifted. They basically became more aware of pregnancy and pregnant people, and they were kind of primed to notice more of it. In a way, it's similar to confirmation bias, right? When you have a certain idea yourself, then you will always look for evidence to support that idea, right? We are basically primed to seek out evidence that supports our own cognitive biases. If you think that you are an awful person, you will constantly try and find evidence as to why you are an awful person. So the mailman didn't smile back. You will assume that that means there's something wrong with you. Whilst the person who don't have that idea in their head that they are awful and unworthy will just maybe not even notice that the postman didn't smile back, or just assume that the postman had a bad day. I often say that, you don't see the world as the world is, you see the world as you are. So how does this tie into eating disorders? Well, It ties into eating disorders with pretty much everything, right? Especially around diet culture. So very often in recovery spaces, and I see other people in, the recovery, community, who work in the field of eating disorders, talk a lot about diet culture, right? And I do absolutely think there is value in that. There is value in acknowledging and realizing that we live in a society that has a very skewed perception of food, movement, bodies, etc., etc. Then again, I sometimes wonder if some people, because they are in the field of eating disorders recovery, whether professionally or personally, will kind of tend to, what can I say? They will notice it a lot more than someone who is not in that field. So for example, me, when I was sick, I felt like the whole world revolved around diet culture. It was everywhere. I couldn't go out and I would just be bombarded with it, right? And now, the same level of diet culture exists. If anything, some people may argue that it's more of it. Yet I just don't notice it as much anymore because it's not what I'm primed to focus on. If I'm sitting in the room and there are 10 different conversations around me, the one that I will notice before, I would always notice the one about diet culture, the one about dieting, someone starting a diet, someone body shaming someone. That's what I would notice. Whilst now, if there are 10 conversations, one of them being diet culture and one of them being about, dogs, I'll probably notice the dog one instead because I find that more interesting. And I think that in recovery, part of why people are so primed towards diet culture is not necessarily an interest per se, but it can also be a way to protect themselves a little bit. Very often people can become so protective over their recovery and become convinced that if they listen to one diet culture conversation, then their recovery will immediately be in danger because they'll be triggered. And therefore they're constantly on guard, terrified that someone may say something. So you're just never at ease. In a social situation, you just sit there very tense, just waiting for someone to say something that could be interpreted as a little bit diet culture-y, right? And it's almost like people think that if they can just be prepared, so don't catch them off guard, they will somehow protect themselves. But actually what can happen is that sometimes this can isolate people, right? So they become scared of engaging with the real world in case someone says something. And don't get me wrong, if you have certain friends or family members or people around you that are just extremely invested in diet culture and you feel like being around them is not healthy and you try to set boundaries and you don't respect them, of course you're allowed to take a step back, right? You don't have to go grab a coffee with that one friend that you know is on a keto diet and can't shut up about it. But equally, I want to remind you that you are also in a stage where you will tend to notice these conversations more and you will be primed to focus on them more and place higher value on them, higher importance of them than you would if you didn't have an eating disorder. It is nothing wrong with you. It's just how human beings work, right? We all have, to some extent, a confirmation bias, and we all have a bit of selective attention. We will always look for signs or find signs that confirm whatever we are looking for. This does not mean that diet culture don't exist. I'm not trying to gaslight you into saying, oh, diet culture is not real. You're just imagining it, because that's not the case at all. I also don't want to reinforce the idea that everything is diet culture. Everyone is diet culture. And I see this sometimes reinforced in recovery spaces, even by people who work with eating disorders. And I don't necessarily think that is correct or healthy, because I think that if you get that messaging, you're thinking, well, everything is about diet culture anyway, so why would I recover then? How can I recover when everyone thinks about diet culture? Diet culture is everything, everywhere. It's all that matters. So I think here it's important to kind of acknowledge several truths at once, right? You can acknowledge diet culture exists. We have a culture that is weird around food and have certain ideas that are not necessarily healthy. And the truth is, not everyone is heavily invested in diet culture. And you can also find your people and your spaces that don't have diet culture as a major focus. And equally, you are also programmed to focus more on it than someone without an eating disorder. So you will tend to see more of it than someone who don't have a problem with food, body, exercise. And equally, when you see it, you will tend to be more affected by it, right? You can maybe hear someone making a comment about, oh, I was so naughty, I had cake today, and that can ruin your whole day, or you can feel like it ruins your whole mood and causes you extreme guilt. But that was just one out of many things that person said that day. But it's that one thing you are looking for, or a program to focus on and will memorize. And you may forget the fact that that person was relaxing eating pizza with you yesterday and didn't say anything, right? But you remember that one triggering comment. And these triggering comments, as frustrating as they can be, very often these comments are people more say them because that is the social script, right? It is a social script, a socially acceptable thing that when you have cake as kind of a joke, which I think is not funny or not, I think it's kind of silly. People sometimes say, ooh, I was naughty. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are implying that they are a bad person for doing so, right? But the eating disorder will take things very, very seriously. And this is because you are wearing the eating disorder glasses. So essentially the eating disorder glasses are these glasses that you put on that makes you hyper-focus on diet culture, twist things to fit that narrative, look for diet culture and kind of be a bit on the edge, a little bit like, okay, are these people going to say it? And you very, very reactive when it happens. Even if you don't necessarily react outwardly to other people, you may notice internally there's a strong reaction to it. The eating disorder glasses is also always making you see justification as to why engage in disordered behaviors, right? So for example, if your friend made a comment about being naughty for having some cake, you will tend to see this as proof that means that eating cake is naughty and therefore you shouldn't do it. And this is another thing with the eating disorder glasses. It always looks for evidence as to why you shouldn't do the recovery thing and should do the eating disorder thing, not the other way around. So the eating disorder glasses will make you hyper-focus and really memorize that one friend who made that comment about being naughty for eating cake, but it will completely ignore that the other people around the table also ate cake and they didn't say anything around that. They just enjoy the cake. You can have 10 people being free and flexible with food and one person being restrictive or saying something wrong, and you will hyper-focus on that one person, not the 10 other people. But even if it were so that everyone around that table were just talking diet culture and talking about being naughty for eating cake whatsoever, even if you are one of the people who are in environments where this is a common script, it doesn't mean that you have to engage with it. It doesn't have to mean that you need to partake, not in the script, not in the behavior. You need to think, does this script, does this environment, does this behavior help me? I could always go and find an environment that is extremely orthorexic and would encourage me to cut out this, cut out that. Could always go find it or use that as some kind of justification to do things. But why would I? Because it wouldn't benefit me in any way, shape, or form. And I know that. Deep inside, I know that. Honestly, I don't even have to dig deep to know that. But during my eating disorder, I would often subconsciously look for confirmations as to why being disordered was a good thing. Equally, whenever I saw something recovery promoting, I would kind of, I'll see it, but I wouldn't give it as much importance. So if I saw one person talking about cutting out sugar and then another person talking about, eat whatever you want, include sugar in your diet, then chances are I would really memorize the cut out sugar person. The good news about this is that the more recovered you become, the more your life starts revolving around other things than the eating disorder, and also eventually around other things than recovery, because that's another thing, right? Even though it's important that you can't let go of recovery until you're recovered, right? Sometimes people just want to skip the whole recovery and just be like, I'm fine now, I'm normal, I'm going to eat intuitively and everything's going to be fine, right? You do have to go through recovery. But the point is, as you are becoming a recovered person whose life doesn't revolve around eating disorder recovery anymore, then you will notice that your focus will shift. And this doesn't mean that you won't feel pressures anymore. It could just mean that you will feel different kinds of pressure, right? So we talk about diet culture and there being a huge diet culture pressure to, related to diet culture in society, which is true. But also, for example, there's a huge pressure to find a partner and get married and have family. Notice how people with eating disorders will very often not necessarily care that much or hyper-focus that much on that specific pressure, right? They will instead focus on the pressures related to diet culture. And that's when you start thinking, is it just you being someone who's just very easily influenced by societal pressure? Or is it the eating disorder making you selectively choose one type of societal pressure that best fit the narrative of your eating disorder? And this is very often what I see, someone recovers from an eating disorder, instead of being like, oh shit, everyone around me is dieting, they're instead like, oh shit, everyone around me is having babies now, right? And of course, different pressures can exist at once. You can feel like everyone is dieting and having babies, or you can feel like everyone who are having babies are also dieting. We can always go that route, right? But essentially, my core point is that as you change, your perception also change. So for example, with an eating disorder, if you're scrolling through Twitter, right, you will see hundreds of different tweets, but chances are it's the one that has to do with maybe some kind of diet culture thing or cutting out that food or whatsoever that you will really memorize. The other 100 tweets that you saw will kind of just, it will kind of just miss you, right? And this is just the way human brains work. We are exposed to so much information in one day, especially with social media. Like, we are exposed to so much in a day that we have to filter out. And the way our brains work is essentially our brain chooses what deems the most important and relevant for us, right? And when you have an eating disorder, very naturally, that's going to be things related to that. Imagine if our brain just took in and saved absolutely everything we saw and read in a day. We would go insane, right? So try and think that the eating disorder glasses is, at the end of the day, it is a protection mechanism, right? It is something that can be very handy because we kind of need to selectively prioritize what kind of information we take in. The problem is that the eating disorder glasses specifically, even though it is from a bit of a psychological point of view, an attempt for your brain just to, please you and, prioritize on things that it had registered that means a lot to you, it can very quickly become destructive, right? Because it can reinforce itself. It reinforces the fact that the eating disorder is useful and necessary, that certain things have a huge value, such as thinness, eating a certain way, moving a certain way, that these are extremely valuable things. And it can overall just make recovery feel quite triggering and hopeless because everything is about diet culture anyways, right? And it's like, yeah, diet culture is a big part of society. We do have that. It exists. But is it really true that everyone is just entrenched in diet culture? Not really. Not really. And remember, someone making the one-off kind of slightly problematic comment that we could always unpack and see what that means doesn't necessarily mean that they are like deeply invested in diet culture. They probably say a lot of random comments that can be interpreted in not the best way. If we're going to look at everything everyone says in a day and the implications behind it, that's going to be a lot to unpack, right? For example, how often do you hear people making jokes about being single, right? We could always go and unpack what is the underlying implication there about being single and that being partnered has higher value, blah, blah. We could always go there, right? Part of being a normal human being in a normal society is understanding that a lot of communication around us, it is a social script. Yes, it has to do with social structures that we all live under. But if you were to dig into everything, it might make you go insane and may not be helpful for you. And maybe sometimes it could be more helpful to kind of just tolerate that, yeah, diet culture is here. There's going to be off comments, right? There's going to be problematic comments, but I can live and recover and do what's best for me regardless. And I can be aware that I'm programmed to put more emphasis on those comments and notice them more. And you're not doing that for other people's comfort. You're doing it for your own. Yes, there are times where having a conversation like, hey, what you said there, that was a little bit, problematic. What is the underlying implication there? Having these kind of conversations with people that you trust, that you know that you can have a good conversation with, can be very, very helpful. For example, your partner make a comment about being lazy because they skipped the gym, right? Yeah, if it is someone that you trust, can have a good conversation with, having a conversation like, hey, I noticed you said that, and the implication would be that rest is bad. We could always go there. Very interesting to have this conversation with people who are receptive towards it. But too often it becomes interpreted as confrontation and can become an argument. And that becomes an argument that your eating disorder would just take fuel from. Because then suddenly the person will feel like justifying as to why they need to go to the gym. And then the eating disorder will just take more and more of that and be like, yeah, here we see more argumentation. I honestly found that one of the most important things I did in terms of transitioning from recovery into the real world, I guess, because I was very isolated in my recovery. I didn't have much friends. I didn't have much social life. I was just pretty much just alone all the time. I didn't have anything. And I was terrified of going out there, making friends. I was terrified that what if I meet someone, make friends with them, and they say something triggering? Because I would see that almost like an attack on me, right? I would kind of categorize people as safe or unsafe based on how invested they were in diet culture, right? And yes, there are times in your recovery where you kind of have to act a bit like that, right? You may have to take a step away from certain people. But equally in the real world, I found it helpful to just reframe how I look at diet culture talk and all of this talk, right? That it is essentially kind of like when people talk about the weather, right? It doesn't always mean that they are just extremely passionate about weather in general. It is just more as part of the social script. It's a socially acceptable form of small talk. And this also goes with diet culture talk. For many people, it's just a bit of a social script, right? There's certain things you say. You know, if you have some cake, some people may feel like it's part of the social script to say, whoa, I was being a bit naughty now, right? And I also started realizing that when people around me say things such as, oh, I want to try cut out gluten, you know, very often for them it was not that deep. For me, these things felt very deep, but for them, very often it was not that deep. They may say they're cutting out gluten in the same way that someone may say, oh, I'm going to start buying, I don't know, only like organic soap and cleaning products. It's not really something that takes over their life. It's not something they think much about. They're probably not that strict. They're probably just like, oh, whatever. And then they forgot about it in 2 to 3 weeks. Another thing that I see quite often with eating disorders, and I think this is something I spoke about in the episode about supporting someone with an eating disorder, and that is something that I call selective mirroring. And this really ties into everything I've spoken about. It's essentially that people with eating disorders have a tendency towards mirroring certain behaviors that they see in the people around them or people at social media that reinforce the eating disorder more than it reinforces recovery. So for example, someone will sit by the family dinner and there will be like that one family member that maybe doesn't eat that much, right? And then they will really strongly mirror that behavior and think of that this means that they shouldn't eat more either, right? But then all the other family members eat very generously, and that completely gets ignored, right? So they will mirror the disordered behaviors very selectively and kind of just ignore the non-disordered ones. And then they will justify it by saying, oh yeah, but it's normal, you know, other people are restricting, other people do this, other people do that, other people go to the gym. And then they completely ignore the people who don't do those things, right? So overall, the point of this episode was just to introduce you a bit to the concept of cognitive biases, confirmation biases, and especially the eating disorder glasses one, and selective mirroring, and all of these things that you may not be fully aware of, but that could really skew your perception, right? And I want to let you know that being aware of these things don't necessarily take them away, right? You being aware that you're programmed to focus on diet culture doesn't necessarily just take that focus away, but it makes you more aware of it so that you can make more of an informed decision around it. You can observe your thoughts almost a bit from a distance and then be more objective and rational around them instead of just taking everything as fact, as confirmation of the delusions your eating disorder is selling you. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and now I'm going to take a listener question. And guys, I am getting so many amazingly interesting listener questions, but also so many of them I feel like, whoa, I can't answer this in like a few minutes. I need an episode for this. And also there's so many of them where I think, whoa, this is such a good topic, but I think that this would be better to be done with someone who has the specific experience. I also have a lot of people messaging or emailing me about, you know, coaching. Do you have spots available? How long is the wait? And the truth is that I do have a bit of a wait right now, and that is because of my health. I've had to take on less clients, and I'm also really sorry that I'm not able to respond to all emails. It is just my capacity is limited. I'm only able to work part-time, and I get so many emails, and it's just impossible for me to answer them all, right? And the truth is I can't give an exact time frame as to when I have spaces, but I am working on, you know, doing some form of group program. If you sign up to my wait list, then I will email you when there's spots available or when I'm doing group work. But please, 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 if you are someone who is acutely in need of support for your eating disorder, please seek out someone else in the meantime. Please don't wait with seeking out support. Please don't feel like you can't get started before working with me, because the best collaborations I have is with people who've already done some work in recovery. Don't let your eating disorder say, oh well, I'm on the wait list so I can just engage in disordered behaviors until coaching starts. First of all, we don't even know if we are compatible for coaching. I don't take on every client that I have a consultation with. And equally, I think a client that's very heavily in that mindset would probably not be ready for coaching. The most common reason as to why I turn away clients is because I deem that they're not yet at the right headspace for coaching, or that it's just not medically responsible. Never have I ever turned away a client because, oh, you're too recovered. You've done too much. Never happened. Never happened. If anything, the clients that have put in some work, done something, challenged, gotten over those like early stages of recovery are the ones I have the absolute best collaboration with, because then we can really get to the, to the interesting part, the letting go, getting out of the quasi, getting rid of those lost fears, finding meaning outside eating disorder and recovery. Those are like the fun things. Those are like the things that I enjoy doing the most, right? Because people often are cognitively the most receptive for coaching when they are not undernourished, when they are not underweight, of course, relative to their set point, when they are not actively over-exercising. So please, please, please don't let my wait list drag out your recovery. If you need urgent support, get it now. And even if the support is not urgent, but you just know that, hey, I need some support right now, start working with someone else. Then you can see maybe it could be that you don't need coaching when you work with someone else. That's completely fine. Or maybe you find that you want to work with someone else for some time and then maybe move over to coaching in the future, or have coaching as an additional form of support, or maybe just kind of see if you still need it. I'm not a salesperson who's just like trying to get everyone to work with me. I don't need to do that and have no desire to doing so. You got to do what's best for you and worst for the eating disorder. So now to the listener question. So essentially the person is asking about protein consumption in recovery. And they are asking how much protein you need in recovery and what happens if you're potentially over-focusing on protein. And also this idea that by eating protein, you gain quote-unquote lean mass. And if you eat, let's say, fat, you gain fat. So let me just debunk this once for all. It is not true that if you just eat a bunch of protein in recovery, you're going to gain a bunch of muscles and no fat. And if you eat fat in recovery, you're going to gain a bunch of fat and no muscles. This is literally just not how human bodies work. So we all have a certain amount of fat and muscles that kind of naturally our body thrives to be in that range, right? So you can be someone who is extremely muscular, but if you're under your set point in terms of body fat range, then chances are you're going to feel a lot of starvation symptoms, potentially extreme hunger, etc., etc. And also, you can eat only protein in recovery, but that doesn't make your body just automatically not gain body fat. Your body will prioritize that. So this person specifically asked more for the physical effects, the physical explanation, rather than the mental bits, and how much there is to unpack with the phobia of gaining body fat and this thing seeing that gaining muscle is somehow superior, right? So I'm going to answer it in a more physical way. When you are ingesting more protein than your body needs, it can get converted into glucose. And basically, glucose is a type of sugar that comes from food, right? Your body uses the sugar for energy. It's a carbohydrate, so you can eat all the protein you want and think, oh, I'm not going to eat any sugar or carbs whatsoever. Yet your body is going to actually just transform that protein into glucose. So you might as well just have the sugar, right? This is why trying to trick your body when you're desperately craving, let's say, cake, and then having like cake flavored protein bar instead is just completely pointless. The reason why you're craving that cake is because you need that sugar, the carbohydrates, the energy. If you need protein, chances are your body will tend to crave high protein foods such as meat, just typical high protein sources. If you're craving cake and you instead reach for a cake-flavored protein substitute, you're not really fulfilling the cravings, right? You're just trying to trick your body into eating a replacement food, right? I will strongly recommend in recovery, don't over-focus on protein. Usually what I see in recovery is when someone is eating a sufficient amount of calories in recovery, I don't really see protein deficiency. That is usually not the type of food that they eat too little of. Yes, there might exist people who have high protein food as a fear food, but in most cases it is the carbohydrates and/or fats people are scared of. And it's often the carbohydrates and fats that they notice they crave. They notice they crave high carbohydrate and/or high fat food. Very interestingly, the people I've seen and the clients and stuff I've had and people I've spoken to who tend to crave meat in recovery are very often vegetarians or vegans, or people who may have had a low protein diet. But even a vegetarian in recovery will tend to crave high fat, high sugar, high carbohydrate foods, often processed foods, because these are easier sources of energy for your body. Hyper-focusing on eating a bunch of protein and having a high protein diet in recovery is not magically going to change your body composition or change your set point. Your body has a natural range it wants you in, right? It wants you to have a certain amount of body fat on your body. Whether you eat protein or fat or carbs whatsoever, your body will fight to get you there. Also, yes, it is true that protein is an important part of building muscle, but so is energy. It's not like you eat a bunch of protein in recovery and build a bunch of muscles. The muscles come because the way muscles are built is that you have broken down muscles and then you give them energy to repair themselves. And you don't need a ton of protein to do this. You just need quite a lot of energy and rest to do this. I know this was a bit of a quick, shortened answer to this, but I have spoken more about this in previous episodes. If you check out the episode about orthorexia, I do talk a bit more about this. And I also have spoken about it a bit more of this hyper focus on muscles, fitness, etc. in the episode The Fitness Trap. So this was just, again, very quick answer to a more complex question. But my point is, I would say don't hyper-focus and stress too much about, oh, I need to eat enough protein, because chances are if you're eating enough food in recovery, you are eating enough protein. What I would be mindful of is trying to eat more calories in general, and especially calories from carbohydrates and fats, because these are the two groups of food that I see people very often skip on, right? Eating a low carb, low fat, low calorie diet in recovery, it's going to make you miserable. It's not going to give your body enough energy to fully repair itself. Ironically, including restoring muscle mass. It's just going to keep you in starvation mode. And again, ironically, keep your body in a stage where it's more primed to save up weight, including body fat, right? This is not a bad thing. It's just your body doing what it wants to do. But it is often the opposite of what people think will happen or what they try to make happen when they enter recovery or whatever you can call it. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode and I look forward to speaking with you guys next week. Hopefully, if there are no more collapses. I think I'll be fine. I will try and pre-record episodes on good days, and then when the bad days or weeks come where I'm just in bed, I will have something ready to just publish, even though I haven't recorded in a while. I'm just human, so there will sometimes be occasional delays, but I hope to see you guys next week. So have a lovely week ahead.